happy to be participating with a number of different organizations and sponsoring these Church Now conversations. We've got Resonate Global Mission, Luminex, Pillar Church, Classis Holland of the RCA, Holland Classis of the CRC. I'm not sure I said those in the right directions, but we've got them, Center for Church Renewal, Pillar Church, are all working together to bring these Church Now conversations to you. And so we're just really glad you're spending some time with us today to hear what Kara has to say about where we are right now in the world. And kind of the way this is going to work for the day is Kara is going to talk to us a little bit about some things that she's seeing going on right now in the culture. And with that, I'm going to pass off to Mike Gaffa, who is with Luminex, and he's going to introduce Kara to us and take it from there. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you, Larry, and just echo the welcome to everybody. We're just grateful that you're here, and trust that this is going to be an awesome Church Now conversation. So Dr. Kara Powell is the executive director of the Fuller Youth Institute. She's associate professor of youth and family ministry. Kara holds a PhD in practical theology from Fuller Seminary, a Master of Divinity from Bethel Theological Seminary, and a bachelor's degree in human biology from Stanford University. Kara served in a wide variety of impactful roles in her career. In 2016, she was named by Christianity Today as one of 50 women to watch, and to that we would say amen. She's had great impact. She is the author or co-author of several books and publications, which, if you're here, you're probably familiar with some of these, including the Sticky Faith books and curriculum, and then, of course, Growing Young, which is a landmark book, and it's impacted many of our churches and really churches across the nation. She lives in Pasadena with her husband, Dave, and their 3 children, and she balances all of this amazing work with being a frequent speaker at retreats and conferences across the country. And so, Kara, we are so grateful that you are leading our Church Now conversation this morning and into the early afternoon, and I turn it over to you now.
Great. Thanks so much, Mike and Larry, and all of you for making me feel so welcome. We do have quite a few Fuller connections, especially with the Michigan area. I know that many of you are from Michigan. I had the pleasure last year in 2019 of speaking at Calvin's January series. Remember when we used to use airplanes? I was actually on an airplane. It's hard to believe. And then outside of California, we at the Fuller Youth Institute have more staff members in Michigan than any other state. We have 2 staff members, Jake Mulder, who happens to be on vacation today, and Dr. Tyler Greenway, who is on this webinar, and he actually really helped coordinate the research for Growing Young, and he's our research director at FYI. So we try to listen carefully to all of Tyler's suggestions and do exactly what he thinks we should. And we're going to talk about a topic today that is personal and deep, and it's arguably more poignant now than even before the pandemic. And that is how we can have faith in an anxious world. So I'm going to share my slides. Can you all see my slides? Give me a thumbs up if you can. Okay, great. I will say I don't go a day. As a parent of 3 teenagers, our kids are 19, 17, and 14. As a researcher, given my role at the Fuller Youth Institute, I don't go a day without somebody asking me questions about mental health. There is such a surge in questions about mental health. In fact, we at FYI would say we get asked more questions about mental health, anxiety, stress, depression, suicide than any other topic right now. And the data of what's happening, most of the data that I have is a US data. I love that there are some folks here from Canada, but we're going to have 2 sections of content and discussion today. In the first part, 15 minutes or so, we're going to focus on why are we seeing this increase in anxiety and mental health questions. And then in the second half, we're going to look at how we respond. So first, we're going to peel back the layers and try to understand what's going on and define that reality, to quote wonderful, beloved senior trustee at Fuller, Max Dupree. We're going to define that reality, and then in the second half, again, we're going to get really practical about what to do, what to say, how to equip volunteers and parents to have the conversations they need to with young people. About 1/3 of the US population will deal with an anxiety disorder at some point in their lifetimes. So extrapolating from that, that probably means about 1/3 of those of us who are on this wonderful webinar today, and about 1/3 of the young people we serve, the people in our churches, the people in our ministries will deal with an anxiety disorder at some point in their lifetime. As soon as we entered the pandemic and social distancing, I immediately became concerned about what was going to happen when it comes to mental health, given loneliness, given fear, given uncertainty. And sure enough, these days during the pandemic, there's some estimates that mental health hotlines are seeing a 40% increase. And for at least one mental health hotline, 75% of the calls they're getting are from people under 25. So clearly this is something that is surging really in all generations, but especially our young people. I like getting us all involved. And so a few times during the course of today, I'm going to ask you to reach out, touch that keyboard, touch that phone, and chat in and answer. So let's go ahead and start. On a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being a lot, how much are you hearing about mental health? So again, great. I'm already seeing some people reaching forward. A lot of 5s, a lot of 4s, some 3s. There's a 2. Okay, not as much, but I would guess that 4 is probably about the average on a scale of 1 to 5. Oh, 2. So clearly this is something that we're hearing about quite a bit, and it's what's drawing us here today to try to learn from each other and from research. What's interesting is schools are talking about mental health, and by and large, the church and families aren't. Teachers are trained in public and private schools how to interact with kids who might be dealing with anxiety, stress, suicide. Churches, families, parents, ministry leaders, step parents, we often aren't being trained, and we want to try to change that as a result of this webinar. We need to talk about mental health because of the kids we care about, because of the teenagers, middle school, high school, even young adults that we care about who are dealing with this. But I also want to point out to you that we need to talk more about mental health because of the kids those kids care about. We've created a Faith in an Anxious World curriculum, and one of the big themes in the curriculum is how much young people need to have a safe adult to talk to about what they're experiencing when it comes to mental health, not only for themselves, but a lot of kids know what's happening with other kids in ways that adults, parents, step-parents might not be seeing. Some of the donors who made this research and the resources possible that I'm going to talk about today, great parents. They had a teenage son who they knew was dealing with depression, but didn't realize how strong that depression was. And he went to a friend and told this friend exactly about his struggles, but made the friend promise not to tell anyone. Well, that teenage son then died by suicide, which of course is terrible on so many levels. And imagine being that friend who was sworn to secrecy and the burden that is as a teenager. So we want to be safe adults for kids to talk about their own struggles as well as what they're wondering or worrying about in others. I mentioned we're going to focus these first minutes on why are there more mental health challenges. And I've got to be totally honest as a researcher. We don't fully know. We can't give clear causation about why there are more mental health challenges these days, but we can suggest some correlations that perhaps are related, or I'll even say are likely related. And it varies young person by young person, ministry by ministry, region by region. So I'm going to offer 4 possibilities, and you can think about, in your neck of the woods, what might be some of the driving factors of these 4 or maybe others. The first is technology. Now, I am very pro-technology. Technology is what is allowing us to have this conversation as we're having it today. Technology is a great relational tool on so many levels. But it's interesting, as the smartphones became particularly ubiquitous, common in young people, we saw shifts in risk behaviors. I'm grateful that many risk behaviors in young people have actually decreased in the last 5-8 years. And those risk behaviors that have decreased slightly include premarital sex, alcohol, other substance abuse, overall partying. Those have decreased. And I'm not talking about during the pandemic. I'm talking about even before the pandemic. But other risk behaviors have increased, and those risk behaviors that have increased are the ones we're talking about today: anxiety, stress, depression, suicide. One way that I would interpret that data is risk behaviors that young people generally experience with others, kind of partying with other people, etc. Those are the ones that are decreasing. Risk behaviors that young people experience on their own, and again, this was pre-pandemic, even, are the ones that are increasing. Risk behaviors that they are more likely to navigate on their own in their rooms are the ones that are increasing. I graduated from high school in 1987. Woo, class of 87. And when I graduated from high school, if I wasn't invited to a party, I maybe heard about that party on Monday morning. Well, today's young people, when they're not invited to gatherings, they see those gatherings unfolding in real time on the devices in their hands. If I was a teenager today, I know I would be dealing with anxiety, fear of missing out, etc., heightened sense of rejection. So a lot of ways that technology serves us, and it increases our awareness of what others are doing without us, which can increase our stress and anxiety. If you're a parent or step-parent, guardian, raise your hand for a moment. Okay, I'm seeing hands up. We need to look at ourselves in the mirror a little bit. There probably are some ways that we're parenting that are not helpful for mental health. Many of us are probably putting too much pressure on our kids. Perhaps even more commonly, many of us are rescuing our kids, being those helicopter parents that we've heard about for the last decade or so, are rescuing our kids, preventing them from navigating challenges on their own, so they don't end up with the muscles of resilience, or what Angela Duckworth calls grit, that they might develop if we hadn't rescued them. So they don't quite have the emotional experience of navigating hardship, because we as parents have worked so hard, by and large, to prevent them from experiencing those hardships. My friend and colleague at Fuller, Scott Cormode, a parent of now 2 20-somethings, says that he feels a tension as a parent. He wants to protect his kids from all pain on the one hand, but secondly, he wants his kids to have the kind of grit and character that usually only comes through pain and suffering. And I know I can certainly relate to that. So there's probably a way that our parenting might be related to what's happening with young people's mental health. Busyness. Again, especially pre-pandemic, busyness. Young people were so very busy. Lisa D'Amour, who is a psychologist who studied adolescent girls, but I think what she says is by and large just as relevant for adolescent boys. She recommends that teenagers have 25% of their waking hours be unstructured and unscheduled. I gotta say, it was the rare teenager before the pandemic who I knew who had that kind of unstructured time. Now, that is something the pandemic is bringing us, is more unstructured time. But for a lot of young people, busyness is likely a factor. And then there's brain biology. The brain is like any other organ, like our hearts, like our kidneys, like our liver. Sometimes we need medicine to regulate it, or other therapeutic inventions, seeing a therapist, etc. We're going to talk about that more in the second half, but that is certainly a factor. Sometimes it's beyond an individual's immediate control when they're experiencing mental health challenges. So I would love to have you weigh in for a moment before we take Q&A. Why is it sometimes hard? And this is when, again, I want you to please reach forward, touch that laptop, touch that computer, use those thumbs on your phone. Why is it sometimes hard to talk about anxiety, depression, and suicide? Would love to have you chat in. Unstructured, yeah, thank you. I appreciate that question. Unstructured meaning not, I'll say no specific calendared activity. So that could be relaxed with friends and family, doesn't have to be on your own, but not in a structured, scheduled activity. Okay, it's really important reasons that we sometimes don't talk about it. It hits too close to home. Shame, a number of you have mentioned shame. It might seem like we're reacting, being dramatic. We fear that we're going to make it worse. There's a stigma attached to those things. It's often dealt with privately for parents. Yes, again, because of the stigma, many families don't want to talk about it. Yeah, the discussion itself causes us intense anxiety. That is one of the interesting things, is sometimes we get anxious about our anxiety. Our anxiety increases about our own anxiety, which of course becomes a bit of a vicious cycle. So one of the things that I'm hoping happens as a result of this webinar is that even these mental health struggles are a little bit more normalized, and are something that we feel like we can talk more honestly about. Too vulnerable, unable to function. Yes, poor theology. Thank you for mentioning that, Leslie. Yes, there's this idea that if we just prayed harder, if we just memorized more scripture, then we'd be better and those problems would go away. We're going to look in the second half of our time together in the how on what I think is the role of especially scripture in navigating mental health. But a lot of times, a lot of people need more support than prayer and Bible study. As much as I believe in that, and I teach young people that myself, I practice it myself when I'm anxious, at least I try to. Philippians 4, bringing those requests to God, and the peace of God passes all understanding. Nonetheless, there are often additional tools we need beyond that. Okay, so this is the end of part 1, and I believe we're going to go ahead and go now to Q&A with any questions that have come in or any questions that Mike, Larry, and others want to raise.
Yeah, so go ahead and use the chat function as you have questions, and we'll make sure that those go over to Kara.
Just catching up some on the chat. Sarah, you know what you said at the very end about university students don't want to talk to their parents about their struggles. Yeah. Again, a lot of parents have not made their homes safe places for their kids to talk about those struggles. I've seen many church leaders offer to accompany that young person, that teenager, that college student, that young adult, to have a conversation with parents or step parents. So that is indeed a way that we can support and mentor and journey with young people navigating these kinds of struggles. Yeah, Larry, the great question. Where do we see increased stress during COVID? Do they connect with any of the reasons that you've mentioned? You know, technology is complicated in the pandemic. There's some evidence that actually there's social support being offered for isolated young people through technology. So I would say during the pandemic, it's possible that for some young people, technology is even more a force for good than before the pandemic. But nonetheless, there's still these risks with technology. And so in terms of you seeing what other people are doing, or at least how they're connecting, you're not a part of it, et cetera. So this is where, you know, part of what we want leaders to do is really be able to equip parents to know how to have conversations with their kids, to check their kids' social media accounts, to check their kids' texts, et cetera, and see what's going on. So technology is a little bit more complicated in the pandemic, because even just in this last week, Tyler Greenway on this call and I, we were looking at research that shows that actually technology can be very helpful in mitigating against mental health challenges. I will say one that isn't on the list that is particular in the pandemic is just the uncertainty. That can be very stressful for everybody, parents and students and young people. We don't know how long this is going to last. We don't know what tomorrow holds. All those sorts of questions that we're we're navigating in a new normal way almost. That is a fifth factor that I didn't mention. That's fairly pandemic. It's more pandemic specific. So
Kara, there was a question. What is the role of the breakdown of family structure, and is it minimized role of church in society? Kind of a double pronged question there.
yeah, absolutely. Kids need caring adults. But let me just say that fundamentally, kids need caring adults to thrive. A lot of times those caring adults begin at home. During the pandemic, though, since we keep talking about the pandemic, I'll bring that up again. For a lot of kids, we at California, we have the safer at home rule. Sadly, for a lot of young people, home is not a safe place. The adults who are their safest places are not in the home with them. And that is where, once again, the church and the intergenerational relationships that have been such a theme in our research are so important that, if I could wave a wand, I would love to see every young person in the U.S. connected with a caring adult and ideally a Christ-following adult who can journey with them through everything that they're experiencing, including mental health. So, certainly I would just say the web of relationships that kids need, when that tends to get stretched or thinned out, kids can lack the social capital, feel more isolated, and that can be correlated with increased stress and anxiety. So.
And then there's a couple of questions that kind of run together a little bit regarding the role of pastors, the reality of that we're not all trained to be mental health professionals, and kind of where do those lines get drawn? How does the church add value rather than make the problems more difficult?
Yeah, great question. And hats off to those of you who are asking that question and showing that awareness. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in the second half of our time together. But I would say, one of the most important steps you can take is to have referrals to mental health professionals at your fingertips, where you can refer congregants, young people, parents, psychologists, therapists, ideally that you somehow vetted or at least know something about their background and have confidence in the services they offer. I would say the moment that you start to feel like you're over your head, you are over your head. So, and maybe even before that. But for sure, when you start to wonder, gosh, is this beyond me? It almost certainly is. And so, as a youth pastor, that was just one of my practices, is I had a handful of therapists that I could refer kids to, I could refer families to, especially those that were financially affordable, sliding scale, took most insurance, et cetera, because money immediately becomes a factor. And so that preventatively is one of the most important things that you can do. And, often youth pastors don't necessarily know therapists. I would say ask other pastors at your church who they might recommend. A lot of times schools actually have pretty strong therapist referrals. They might not be faith-based, depends on the school, it depends on the therapist, but those are two places you can go if you're not sure how to even find therapists that you'd feel comfortable recommending.
So Carrie, here's a question. It's a lengthy, I'm going to read it verbatim, and maybe you have it in front of you, from Lucinda. As parents and leaders, we can't give the hard answers and challenges because
I'm going to pull ahead. He's just finishing, so you can have that pump then.
Hey, Brian, thank you.
Well, we're experiencing life real time here together. So
yeah, that's right.
How many of you just now checked to make sure that you were muted? I'm betting a lot of people double check, wait, am I muted? So yes.
So, because too often our children take the easy way out via the internet. And while we want to help our kids out as young people, they simply haven't grown enough to choose the hard route to get to a healthy place. And it becomes a nasty cycle. As parents, we are now one of many options. Can you kind of speak into that a little bit?
Oh, such a good question, Lucinda. And you're really bringing up questions about emotional resilience in young people. I would say two things. Number one, understand the developmental stage that your kid is in, and what kind of obstacles that they can accept. Let me just say that our kids, we have a college sophomore, we have a high school now senior, and we have a high school now ninth grader. And Dave and I, as we're parenting that senior, we're really trying to remove the safety net as much as possible from her so that she experiences some challenges, some mistakes, even this year, while she's under our roof. Because if we keep if we keep being the pillows around her, if we keep being the goalie, keeping the ball of pain out of her soccer net, then that transition to college is going to be a whole lot harder. So I would say, we as parents, we need to monitor what our kids are capable of, and the older they get, the more that we step back. And Steve Argue and I actually get into this in our book, Growing With, how we as parents need to transition our role from being teachers to teenagers to being more guides and letting them make some of their own choices, and where we take a step back and intervene only when it's really necessary. But I would say, I'm going to sound like a broken record today, because I so believe in the power of intergenerational relationships, that this is an area where sometimes kids don't hear truth very well from parents. And so the more that we can help parents and families connect that young person with other adults. My kids, sometimes Dave and I have been saying the same thing for years or decades, and they hear it, let's just say they hear it fresh and new from a non-parent. And so that would be something else that I would just keep encouraging.
Kara, I have a question. I noticed, in the four things that you mentioned, politicization isn't in there, but we all know how real that is these days. Is that much of a factor, and specifically, is it a factor for younger people in ways like it is for many of us?
Yeah, I'm sorry, Mike, I missed the word that you said. What's the word that wasn't in there?
Politicization.
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah, fascinating question. Well, I would say certainly that tension, conflict can be anxiety producing for many people of all ages. I know for those of us who live in the US, the upcoming election, we might even be a little bit anxious about what it means for our churches, as we probably have congregants from both sides or all sides of the aisle who have a hard time believing that a follower of Jesus could vote for anyone else other than the person they are voting for. I think that's a very real tension that we as church leaders might be anxious about. For young people, it's interesting. I will highlight something that's been worldwide, but I'm more familiar with it in the U.S. Just the racial related protests that have erupted since late May, and the way that young people have really been involved in those. There are many cities, regions, individual protests where young people have literally led the way. The largest march ever in the city of Nashville was led by 6 teenagers, 10,000 people. This was in early June, and the 6 teenagers had never even met each other face to face. They organized it all by social media. And I actually think that kind of purposeful outlet is a very meaningful opportunity for young people today. So while conflict, tension, lack of unity can be anxiety producing for people of any age, when young people are involved in purposeful work, when they're serving, when they're involved in justice, that actually can be something that protects them from those feelings of isolation, stress, anxiety. And for those of us who are parents, or those of us who work with parents, this is something that families can do together. Every Thursday, our family serves at a food distribution center from 3 to 5 o'clock. So I'll be there today. And it's after the food is all distributed. We're there with masks and gloves, and we sweep and mop, and we break down boxes, and we bag food. I've swept and mopped more there than I have my own home since March, by far, not even close. But that's something that's an important practice for our family in this season. So church leaders, as you can provide opportunities for families to serve together, for young people to lead in student ministry, you know, as we look ahead to an uncertain fall with probably a lot of church ministry being offered virtually and not in person. I don't think there's ever been a better time for us as adults to let kids lead. They have more time than they ever have. They have more tech savvy than most of us. They're in touch with students in a way that we probably aren't. And so, you know, as we do what we call in Growing Young, hand the keys, or show keychain leadership, hand the keys over to young people. That is something that has all sorts of positive correlations with pro-social outcomes. So I would say involving young people in purposeful work is very meaningful in this season. So thanks for asking that good question.
Yeah, so we're going to do one more question before we move forward. It's going to come from Gary. Let me first say thank you for those who have posted some of the resources on mental health. If you haven't gone into the chat to check that out, do that. There's some links to some of that. But last question before our breakout, and from Gary, is brain biology a given across the years, or is there something now with brain biology that is different than in previous generations? Is there something in the previous 3 factors that is affecting brain biology?
You know, I saw that question in chat and I thought, I don't know the answer to that. And so sure enough, it's the one that we're incorporating here. I really don't know. And I try to be very tentative, and I just don't answer questions when I don't fully know the answer to that. So, but like a lot of things, you know, is it that we're more aware of changes, or are there actually more changes? Food allergies comes into that category too. You know, so I don't feel comfortable answering that question, but great question, Gary. And if somebody has an answer, please go ahead and chat that in. Dr. Tyler Greenway, if you have any sense, our Director of Research, feel free to chat in an answer, but because I would love to learn, but I don't know the answer to that question.
Great, fair enough. So I think at this point, Kara, we are going to do breakouts, and I think you have a question for us to wrestle with.
Yes, absolutely. And I believe it's going to appear in your breakouts, but I can foreshadow it a little bit. And we're going to get a little bit more personal with that why question and ask, with the young people you know, what factors lead to potentially greater anxiety and stress? With the young people you know, what factors lead to potentially greater anxiety and stress? So it could be one of the 4 that I mentioned, something that's come up in discussion verbally or chat since then. Go ahead and get a little deeper, more specific with the young people you know. And sure, I can list the 4 again, absolutely. They are technology, parenting, busyness, and brain biology. Those are the 4. So technology, parenting, busyness, brain biology, or what else you're seeing. So let's enjoy our group time together.